We have now to have a closer look at the various vehicles, ships and aircraft. And not only what they are under the law of naval warfare, but also to have a look at their crews and what their status is or is not under the law of naval warfare. And of course, let's start with a simple category, which is not as simple as it may seem: warships and military aircraft. We have that distinction. Why? Because under the law of naval warfare, only vessels and aircraft qualifying as warships or military aircraft are entitled to exercise belligerent rights. And remember, it's not only about attacks, it's also about prize measures: visit, search, diversion, and capture. That's very important to keep in mind. So if you want to exercise belligerent measures at sea or in the air, you need to have a warship or a military aircraft doing that. Don't use other platforms. That would be prohibited. This very strict requirement, just as a reminder, does not apply in non-international armed conflicts. Okay? Not in non-international armed conflicts. Remember the Tamil Tigers, they had some aircraft which they had stolen somewhere, or some fast vessels that they had stolen from the Sri Lankan armed forces, which they then used against them. They are not warships, of course, because they are in the hands of the rebels, but therefore that very formal requirement does not apply. Why is it important? Because we are exercising belligerent rights outside our territorial waters, in high seas areas. And that's why we have that requirement of only warships and military aircraft qualifying to exercise such belligerent rights. All of you are more or less familiar with Article 29 of the Law of the Sea Convention of 1982. Belonging to the armed forces, external marks, under the command of a commissioned officer, manned by a crew under regular armed forces discipline. We know all that. However, we have to read and understand that definition in light of its historical context. It's very important to keep in mind. So remember, there may be a ship with not a single weapon on board. It would nevertheless qualify as a warship if the other elements are fulfilled. Arming is not necessary. Many people forget that. Many navies have supply ships that are under the command of an officer, not of a civilian master, and they would then qualify as warships. Very important to keep in mind. So if, however, a vessel is not under the command of an officer, commissioned officer does not mean that the officer must have been commissioned, like in the US, starting from a certain rank by the Senate. It suffices if that individual is an officer, could even be a petty officer who would be in command of the respective vessel. But if a vessel is not under the command of an officer, this does not qualify as a warship, only because of that. Even though it may be operated by the Navy, it is not a warship. So it's rather an auxiliary. Why is it important? Well, depends on your perspective. If you want to use a vessel for the exercise of belligerent rights, forget about auxiliaries. They are not allowed to do that. On the other hand, both warships and auxiliaries are lawful targets. Okay, so don't confuse the one with the other. Remember, the historical context is the abolition of privateering in 1856. We don't want private businessmen, even though they may have been authorized by the government. By the way, that was only the British Queen in those days, okay, who was broke and desperately wanted to get her hands on the Spanish gold, which they had stolen from South America. And there were only some courageous businessmen like Francis Drake, who said, okay, I'll do the job. I get my share, Your Majesty, and you authorize me to do that. You give me a letter of marque. And so he would not qualify as a pirate, but he would qualify as a pirateer. And that was eventually abolished in 1856. We don't want businessmen and a crew composed of criminals to exercise belligerent rights. Okay, we want those rights being exercised by those who are under regular armed forces discipline. Now, there are two things connected with that. The requirement of a crew under regular armed forces discipline, if we have a manned platform, does not mean that the entire crew has to consist of members of the armed forces or those under regular armed forces. So you may have contractors on board, all right, for a variety of reasons and purposes. That does not change the status of the vessel. First thing. The other thing is, of course, what about these, the unmanned vehicles? And what about militia vessels? You are very familiar with that category, aren't you? And so this begs the question, what are they, for heaven's sake? What are they? Now, if you look into the Newport Manual, you will find unmanned maritime systems. This one is a very autonomous one, okay? Surface platform. Pretty sophisticated technology. And I think the Newport Manual rightly states that the decision on whether a ship is a warship or not lies not with international law. It lies with the respective state. So if a state designates a ship a warship, then it is a warship, period. Why is that important? Because remember I talked about it the other day, there is no requirement of a platform being manned in order to qualify as a warship. Because it's just the abolition of privateering. So in other words, if an unmanned vessel is under the control or command of a responsible officer, then it is a warship, even though there is no single person on board. And then you may use that platform for the exercise of belligerent rights, if the state has designated the vessel as a warship, which you will identify by it being included into the registry of warships of the respective state, even though many states do not disclose their registries of warships. But I mean, that is an evidentiary problem, not a fundamental problem. Okay? And I told you the other day, states will increasingly do so, out of necessity, So there may be some opposition still, but this opposition will disappear in not too long a time from now. Many states have already taken first steps, and you will then see a full-scale warship without a single person on board. So, and I think here the Newport Manual, remember we are now talking about the chapter 3 of the Newport Manual. So if you want to follow the lecture, just open the Newport Manual, chapter 3. You will find all those different categories of vessels there. So if it is a warship, it has been designated a warship, then it is a warship. And you may use those devices for the exercise of belligerent rights. Now be a little bit careful. Some confuse the exercise of belligerent rights with a merely supportive role of such platforms. A supportive role is always okay. For example, if you have a blockade and if you want to monitor the blockade area, you can do that by all kinds of unmanned vehicles because they don't exercise rights. They are just assisting in becoming aware of whether a vessel tries to sneak in or sneak out. All right, that's a merely supportive role. That's not exercise of belligerent rights. So, there are some open questions. What about the Poseidon, which is a Russian system, unmanned, carrying a nasty weapon, which may even create a tsunami designed to attack coastal areas and create a tsunami. It looks like a torpedo, but it's very big. It's recoverable, so it need not be one. If you once launch it, it may return, or it may not return, depending on whether it has been initiated to explode. What is that? Is that an unmanned maritime vehicle where we have to be concerned about whether it's a warship? No, no, we would not even dream of doing so with a torpedo. Okay, a torpedo is a device that is designed to attack platforms, but it's not a warship or anything alike. It's a lawful means of warfare. And you will talk about means of naval warfare tomorrow. All right? The same holds true for the so-called kamikaze drones. I don't know who invented it, but I think it's not necessarily pleasant for Japanese kamikaze fighters who more or less gave their lives by crashing into US warships. This is not kamikaze, all right? It's just a device, an explosive device, which is directed against lawful targets. So it's not a warship, okay? It's just another explosive device directed against enemy targets. So rather akin to a torpedo, it has nothing to do with warships. One unresolved question is, however, the status of small craft. What are they? Well, as long as they are an integral part of a controlling surface platform, then they will share the status of that platform. So they would be an integral part of a warship. But what if they operate independently? Are they warships? Are they not? Not really clear. I think, Pete, even in the US, you're still struggling with that issue, whether small craft can qualify as warships at all. I tend to say yes, because if they are operated by the regular armed forces of a state, why would they not? But those are rather domestic reasons, okay? But keep in mind, it's not absolutely clear what their status is. So make up your mind and take a decision, okay? Don't just say, okay, bad luck. No, you have to be clear about that. Remember, once in a while it happens that parties to the conflict engage small craft. So will you only tell them, yeah, you're only entitled to act in self-defense? You are not allowed to take proactive measures? I would say rather yes, but unresolved. Now, with military aircraft, we are on the safe side. Why? Because if they are operated by the armed forces, if they are under the command of an officer, then they are aircraft, even though there is no single person on board. Why? Because we already know from 1944 Chicago Convention, that is the Civil Aviation Convention, which has Article 8. And the heading of Article 8 is pilotless aircraft. So no one ever doubts that a drone, I hate the word drone, this is stupid. A drone is nothing but a suppressed male bee. It's an acronym, of course. It stands for Dynamic Remotely Operated Navigational Equipment. That's where it comes from. Drone, it sounds cool, right? But I'd rather use the word unmanned aerial vehicle, which is, I think, more correct. And since it's an aircraft, and if it's operated by the armed forces, if it is marked as such, if it's under the command of an officer, and if it's controlled, manned, or pre-programmed by those under regular armed forces discipline, it is a military aircraft. This is unfair, right? They are struggling with vessels, whether they can qualify as warship if they are not manned, and with unmanned aerial vehicles, no problem at all. It's not necessarily logical, I would say. Pilots are only cool because they wear leather jackets, okay? Sailors, they do the real job, okay? So all these are military aircraft, you can use them for the exercise of belligerent rights. No, not the slightest doubt as to their status. Now, there are many other categories of vessels out there. I already mentioned auxiliaries, other state ships, and militia vessels. Now, what is an auxiliary vessel? It's a vessel owned or operated by the armed forces, yeah. Of course, primarily for non-commercial governmental services, making also a contribution to the war effort by supplying arms or whatever, refueling or whatever it may be. And the difference between them and a warship is but that they are not under the command of a commissioned officer. They are under the command of a civilian master. So that distinguishes warships from auxiliaries. And there are many auxiliaries. Look at them. I mean, at first glance, gray hull, they look like warships, but they are not. The same with those ships, okay? So you must have some rather reliable intelligence, whether and to what extent they are or they are not. Not for targeting purposes, but for the question whether they are entitled to exercise belligerent rights. That's the issue. That's the issue. So auxiliary vessels are not entitled to exercise belligerent rights. Not. Okay? But the performance of their functions, remember auxiliary, assisting the armed forces or the belligerent, is of course important. So if they are transporting military forces or equipment, if they are used for the refueling of warships or of the arming of aircraft or ships, they are auxiliary vessels, or they may even support mining operation or mine countermeasures, then they are not warships anyway. However, they are allowed to defend themselves. Okay? They are allowed to defend themselves. On the other hand, that's the flip side of it. They are not allowed to do a lot, but they are lawful targets. That's very unfair, very unfair. But remember, there are good reasons for that distinction, for historical reasons, in particular the abolition of privateering. We will talk about them, whether they are lawful targets or not. The short answer is yes. See them, think them. Sink them, not think them, sink them, all right? So, other state ships. Well, there are many other state ships. I mean, you know, Coast Guard vessels. But already be careful here. In some states, Coast Guard vessels, in times of armed conflict, are becoming warships, all right? For example, the US Coast Guard, in times of war, they will be belligerents, even though usually they will only perform law enforcement functions. But in times of armed conflict, they are assimilated or integrated into the regular armed forces. Therefore, they become combatants. Therefore, US Coast Guard vessels would be entitled to exercise belligerent rights. So it depends very much on the domestic law, whether or not they so qualify. Of course, all those state ships enjoy sovereign immunity, but sovereign immunity is not the issue, because any state property enjoys sovereign immunity, all right? So therefore, what is important is that such vessels, unless they have been integrated into the regular armed forces of a state or assimilated to them, they are not allowed to exercise belligerent rights, which may make it very difficult, right? If a Coast Guard vessel, not qualifying as combatant or not having combatant status, is exercising its law enforcement functions, they very much look like what? Visit, search, capture, and so on and so forth. So at first glance, it may be difficult to say, are they now exercising belligerent rights or is it a pure law enforcement function? But with these difficulties, I'm afraid you have to live with, all right? Don't forget, it's just about the status of the platform. We have not yet talked about the crews and the officers of those platforms. Maritime militia vessels. Remember, the term militia occurs in the Geneva Conventions when it comes to those enjoying prisoner of war status when falling into the hands of the enemy. Unfortunately, the Geneva Convention do not provide a definition of a militia. Why would they? Of course, historically, you would say those are forces or components that do not necessarily take part in hostilities full time, but they are only called in if there is a war breaking out, and then the young men and women take their weapons that they have stored in their cupboard, and then they go to war. That is one thing. But you see, they have all kinds of functions, those militia vessels. And of course, the obvious example are the Chinese militia vessels. If you look at what they are, well, if you look at the Chinese militia vessels, whether it's fishing militia or other, they are unintegrated into the PLA. Okay, they are under the command in the hierarchy of the PLA. Although they may be under the command of someone who does not qualify as an officer, then they would be what? Auxiliary vessels. All right? So as simple as that. And if they are auxiliary vessels, remember, lawful targets. Okay? So don't be upset with the difficulties. Hopefully your intelligence community is doing a good job, and they will tell you whether or not and to what extent they are being integrated into the armed forces or under the command of the PLAN, for example. Then you will be able to determine their status, and you will be allowed to engage them accordingly. Now let's talk about the crews of the categories of vessels and aircraft we have talked about so far. We will still have to talk about merchant vessels, all right? So the crews. Well, warships and military aircraft, easy. All the military personnel of warships and military aircraft are combatants, and they enjoy prisoner of war status if they fall into the hands of the enemy. And don't forget the other privilege they enjoy, combatant immunity. So they may not be prosecuted for having participated in the hostilities. We don't do it the Russian way, okay? The Russians do it. They prosecute combatants, enemy combatants, for what they were doing, meaning taking part in the hostilities. Outrageous, flagrant violation of the law of armed conflict. Okay? So, but there are other categories. There may be civilians on board, right? Civilians on board a warship, civilian even on board a military aircraft. I'm not talking about a fighter jet. Don't have too many civilians on board a fighter jet, but a bigger military aircraft, for example, all right? Who are important for the operation of the aircraft. Well, here we have those people who are either the civilian crews. If they are part of the civilian crews, well, they enjoy what? Prisoner of war status. Or they belong to the categories of those who are accompanying the armed forces. Could be technicians, contractors, and so on and so forth. And if those people accompanying the armed forces, according to Article 4A of the Third Geneva Convention, enjoy prisoner of war status. No problem with that. The same with auxiliaries and other state ships. Even though they are not expressly mentioned in Article 4A of the Third Convention, they also enjoy prisoner of war status for obvious reasons. But they are not allowed to engage in the exercise of belligerent rights, right? So they are not combatants, but they enjoy prisoner of war status nevertheless. Be careful. Don't confuse combatant status with entitlement to POW treatment. Not every person entitled to POW status is a combatant, but all combatants are entitled to prisoner of war status. All right? Very important to keep in mind. Now let's turn to the category of merchant vessels. Remember, we talked about the uses of the oceans for sea trade. The numbers vary, but to be on the safe side, I would say more than 85% of all imports and exports go via the sea. All states, including landlocked states, are heavily dependent on merchant vessels. Otherwise, they would not be able to preserve their economy. So the sea will continue to be used by thousands of merchant vessels on an everyday basis. So we need to be clear about their status, and we need to be clear about the status of their crew if we take measures. Now, first of all, what is a merchant vessel? Well, there is no positive definition of warship. There's rather a negative one. So you're saying, well, first of all, they are not warships. Secondly, you are saying they are not auxiliaries. But what's important is they are used for commercial purposes. Commercial purposes, such as transporting cargo or persons, or other commercial activities such as fishing. They all belong to the categories of merchant vessels. So don't think of a container ship only. So the category of merchant vessel is as broad as you can imagine. And it also includes privately owned vessels such as a nice sailing yacht. It's not a merchant vessel. It's not used for commercial purposes. But under the law of naval warfare, they qualify as merchant vessels. So if you fly the enemy's flag on your big yacht, don't get too close to the enemy. The enemy will be allowed to capture your vessel, all right? So that's the first takeaway. Broad category, not just ships transporting cargo. The next question is, what about civil aircraft? Well, it's exactly the same. Here we have again the Chicago Convention of 1944, which first of all applies a negative definition. So if we are talking about civil aircraft, don't say civilian aircraft, it's civil aircraft, then we distinguish them negatively from military aircraft, police, or customs aircraft, which complicates matters a little bit more than when it comes to vessels. Why? Because we know there are other aircraft that are not civil or civilian in nature, but it's belonging to a state, such as this aircraft. This aircraft belongs to the King of Thailand. It's not a military aircraft, like Air Force One of the US president. That's a military aircraft. Okay, Air Force One, well, must be a military one, right? But if it's not a military aircraft, it would nevertheless qualify as a state aircraft. Now, why is that important? Well, they are assimilated to civil aircraft according to the law of air warfare. That's the funny thing about it, okay? But don't forget, even though they are assimilated to civil aircraft under the law of air warfare, this does not mean that vis-a-vis third states, they would no longer enjoy sovereign immunity, because the one has to be distinguished from the other. So the aircraft of the Thai king enjoys sovereign immunity, even though for the purposes of air law, it is assimilated to a civil aircraft. I'm saying that because in Germany, we confiscated that aircraft because there were some debt issues, and we got a little bit into trouble because we said, oh, this is a civil aircraft, we can do that. No, we got it a little bit wrong, okay? But for the purposes of armed conflict, please keep that in mind. Because if it is assimilated to a civil aircraft, are you allowed to capture it? Well, yes, if it's enemy. If it's enemy. Are you allowed to attack it? No. No, because it's not a military objective by nature. It's not military equipment. Okay, a military aircraft, you see it, you shoot it down. Air Force One, sorry, Pete, for that, but it's a military aircraft, so it's a lawful target. But the aircraft of the Thai king is neither a military aircraft nor any other. It's a civil aircraft. So yes, you may capture it, but don't shoot it down unless it is doing something rendering it a lawful target. So you have to be a little bit cautious, okay? Don't say yes too early. You may get into trouble. Good. Now, this begs the question, how do I know whether a vessel or an aircraft is enemy? Well, of course, they are flying flags, right? And in the good old days when we had merchant marines, big ones, we could easily say, this is a German merchant vessel flying the German flag, so no doubt about that, enemy. However, today it has become a little bit more complicated, and be it only for the reason that we have so many flag of convenience states. For example, owner-wise, the German merchant fleet, marine, is pretty big, fourth in the world. But flag-wise, it's a negligible quantity. So how would an enemy of Germany know whether a vessel flying the flag of Panama is a German or a Panamanian vessel? Well, then you have to apply the other criteria, because flying a flag is no final and conclusive evidence of the character of the vessel. So, for example, if it is traveling or sailing under the orders of the enemy, or under the control of an agent placed on board, if it is owned by enemy nationals or by enemy corporations, and if it has been transferred to a flag, to the flag of another state, prior or after the outbreak of hostilities in order to evade the consequences of enemy character, then they all qualify as enemy merchant vessels. Please don't forget that. Not just the flag. The flag is but the first indicator, but not the final and conclusive evidence of its character. So you have to do some investigation, all right? Why is it important? Because every enemy merchant vessel is liable to be captured for the entire duration of the conflict, if any of those criteria is fulfilled. With civil aircraft, it's almost the same. If it bears enemy marks, no doubt. I mean, every vehicle, either flying the enemy's flag or bearing enemy marks, that is conclusive evidence of its enemy character. The problem is if they don't bear enemy marks or do not fly the enemy's flag. And then you have to ask, well, what is it? Now, again, the same criteria. If it operates under enemy control, charter, orders, employment, or direction, it is enemy, even though it may bear the markings of a neutral state. When we told that to representatives of a private air carrier, I can say that here, it was Air France. And we told them, well, listen, I mean, if you are doing this, your aircraft is liable to be captured, at least. And if you are being engaged for, or if you have been chartered for the transportation of troops, your nice little aircraft becomes a lawful target. They were stunned. They couldn't believe it. Well, now they know better. Now they know better, hopefully. But you never know with those guys. So, capture, that is why it's so important to identify the true nature of a vessel or a civil aircraft, because of price law. Remember, however, and that will be covered on Saturday, there are certain enemy vessels and aircraft that are specially protected. And special protection means that it's not only prohibited to attack them, but it's also prohibited to capture them, even though they have enemy character. But those are specially protected categories that will be dealt with in Lecture 8 hospital ships, for example, coastal rescue craft, and. The neutral character of merchant vessel is to be determined exactly from the opposite way. All right? So if a vessel is not operating under the control of the enemy, and so on and so forth, if it's not owned by enemy nationals, if it's not under the control of an agent placed on board, then it is a neutral merchant vessel. So difficult, right? Difficult. Because you have to establish all those criteria. And again, it's not about attacking, it's about capturing. So you have to be doing some thorough work in order to figure out what the respective merchant vessel is. But these criteria are not new. We'll find them already in older documents, such as the Oxford Manual of 1913, where you found exactly those criteria adopted already a long time ago. So nothing new about that. With civil aircraft, it's again similar. If they bear neutral marks, fine, but that's not conclusive because it may be operating or being chartered or employed or directed by the enemy. Then despite its neutral marks, it would not qualify as a neutral civil aircraft and would therefore be liable to be captured. That is the important difference. Now, what about the persons on board such merchant vessels? Well, first of all, you have to see that under the Geneva Convention number 3, we have Article 4A, paragraph 5, which says the crews and officers of enemy merchant vessels, if they fall into the hands of the enemy, enjoy prisoner of war status. Clear category, no doubt about it. You see how important it is now to know whether the vessel is an enemy or a neutral merchant vessel? But they are entitled to prisoner of war status. There is one exception, because Article 4A5 says, unless they enjoy a more favorable treatment. And that's a reference to Hague Convention number 11, meaning that if they promise, after having been released, that they will no longer and no further be involved in the war effort of the enemy, then they may go home. Do you believe them? Well, maybe you do, maybe not, but that is a remnant of the old rules of 1907, which have been explicitly referred to in Article 4A5. Now, with crews and masters, that is quite obvious. What about civilians on board a merchant vessel? Well, they are civilians, right? So if they are civilians, there is no reason to treat them as prisoners of war, unless they are accompanying the armed forces or unless they are undertaking the journey to join the armed forces, etc. That's a different category. But if they are civilians, then yes, you capture the vessel. You have to bring the vessel into port, but then you must release the civilian passengers. Quite clear, not too many doubts. I think today one may argue that we have to distinguish a little further between officers and crews. Why? I'm just saying we should consider. I'm not saying we must consider. Okay? Why? I mean, most of you are here are from the Philippines, right? A famous nation of seafarers, right? Best seafarers in the world. All ship owners are keen on having on their merchant vessels civilian Filipino sailors. And do you blame them if, they are if they happen to be on board a German merchant vessel, and Germany is at war with Demonia, so would you really say, well, yeah, prisoner of war? Well, I think if the enemy nationals are privileged by the more favorable treatment under Hague 11, then one may argue that the crew, which has nothing to say, they are there to obey orders, right, of the master and of the officers. You may also say they can be released. But the rules so far have not been going into that direction. And make up your mind whether you change or adapt your national policy accordingly. When it's neutral merchant vessels and aircraft, officers and crew, no way of prisoner of war status. Why would they? Okay. And there may be, however, a situation where the vessel, a neutral vessel, becomes a lawful target, right? Remember, actively resisting, for example, visit and search. Then they become a lawful target. Arguably, then, they would be entitled to prisoner of war status if they fall into the hands of the enemy. Remember, however, this category is not being addressed in Geneva Convention 3. So this is, if at all, customary law, and many national manuals provide for that they would enjoy prisoner of war status. Passengers, again, unless embodied in the enemy's armed forces, they may, of course, be detained until their status is determined by a competent tribunal. That is what Geneva Convention 3 says. But if they are not enemy nationals, release them as soon as possible. Don't push them overboard, okay? But take them home, treat them humanely, and then let them go, all right? That's what you do with them.